So today we are deploying Strapi content management system to Azure Cloud. Strapi is a headless content management system based on Node.js runtime. It has all the great stuff like GraphQL and RESTful API built in, authentication, permissions, and it's really lightweight. And we're going to be using Azure Docker, CI/CD using GitHub and Azure DevOps, so it should be pretty straightforward. All right, let's get started. Let's install Strapi locally first. Quick guide like this, copy. I'm gonna go to my VS Code and let me rename the project so it's not a default. Strapi app. We'll use Azure demo and we'll use quick start template. All right, so Yarn will install all the dependencies. It's going to take a couple of minutes. Once everything is installed, it automatically opens the admin panel on the port 1337. So let's navigate to that. And the first time you open Strapi app, it will ask you to register first admin user. So let's do that first. And everything is stored in the local SQLite database, so it's not going to be persistent when you deploy anything to production. Okay, so this is the initial dashboard inside of Strapi. You have collections, different plugins, but we're not going to spend too much inside of Strapi. We are going to focus more on a deployment side. So let's go back to VS Code. Let's stop the server and open in a separate window. This is a default Strapi installation. As I said, we're going to be using Docker container. So let's start with that. Let's add Docker file and add a simple Docker commands. It's pretty straightforward because it's a Node.js. As I said, it's pretty lightweight. So we'll use Node 12. It's a stable release as of now. And we'll use alpine distribution of Linux. Again, lightweight. Port by default, Strapi uses 1337, so we'll keep that. Host, we'll use localhost. And environment variable, we need production. So let's expose that. Node env production. Next, let's create app directory. So let's add a comment, app directory. So let's run make dir command. And let's create default app user source app. Okay, and let's make it our work directory. User source app. So this is going to be our work directory. Next, we want to install dependencies. Let's copy our package JSON file. JSON, but we also need to copy package lock. So let's add a wildcard here. We want to copy it to user same directory, user source app. And we also want to copy yarn lock because we're using yarn to install the dependencies, source app, same. Okay, and next we want to run yarn install. So now let's copy everything that's got installed to our work directory. Copy current to user source app and then run yarn build to have a production build. Now we want to expose our port externally 1337, and finally we want to run the start command. So yarn Start. Okay, that should start the application locally inside of the Docker container. With Docker file ready, now we need to worry about the production configuration. How do we connect to production database? How we're going to run production server? So let's add those configuration inside of Strapi config folder. There are already some default configuration done for us. It's optimized to run locally, of course. It uses SQLite, but we need to connect to production database. So let's do that. Let's create env folder here and add production subdirectory. Okay, inside we want to have two files. One is for database, we'll use JSON, and one for server. Okay, so let's have database configuration. All right, so we'll use default connection for our production. Let's do that now and provide all the configurations. So default connection will be default connections. We'll just have one, which is default. Connector, we'll use bookshelf, which comes with Strapi. Settings for this connector will be, all right, first client. Yeah, we'll use MySQL. You have different options like MongoDB, MySQL, Postgres, and a few other options, but we'll stick to MySQL. It's pretty straightforward. Host. So now we don't want to hard code any of the values here. Since we're going to get to username and passwords for our database connection, we don't want to commit that to Git. So ideally, you want to use something like key management, secret management, but we'll use simple environment variables to store these values. So let's use dynamic values. Process env, that's pretty standard for Node. Instance connection name, and you can use any variables you want. It just happens that I use these. Port, we'll use default port for MySQL, which is 3306. We can hard code that. Database name, same. We want to use dynamic variables, so but in this case we want to use database name. For username, same. I want to use database username. And password. Okay, looks good. Next, let's provide some options. SSL, ideally you want to force secure connection, but in this case, for the sake of demo, I'm not going to use SSL. I'm not going to force SSL. Pull, and this is all coming from Strapi documentation, so feel free to refer to documentation for more details. I'm just going to use default values. Pull connection from 0 to 15. Idle timeout in milliseconds. Okay, so our database, production database configuration is all set. Looks good. Hopefully everything connects immediately. All right, so now we can move on to server.js. And it's again, it's pretty simple. So we want to provide a host, and you can refer to default server.js or what values we need. And also you can refer to Strapi documentation. But we also going to use environment variables for that. I want to use host, port, in case port is not provided, we want to use default 1337, and this is what we're gonna use anyway, because that's what we're exposing in the Docker file. Production, yes. Proxy, not really. Cron jobs, no. And admin, for admin, we don't want to auto open in production. Doesn't make sense. Okay, looks good. Because we are using MySQL in production, we want to add the MySQL client to our package JSON. So let's add that, yarn add MySQL. And let's just start it locally, make sure everything still works, nothing is broken. So I'm just gonna start it locally, yarn develop. It is running locally on port 1337. Let's click on that and navigate back. Okay. All right, still up and running. Great. So now we're ready to push it to our GitHub, create a repository, and connect it to Azure. So let's take those next steps. First, we need to initiate local Git. Let's do this. Git init. All right, so it's an initialized empty Git repository and automatically kind of keeps track of everything that's in the current directory. We want to now use GitHub to store the repository, which eventually is going to be connected to Azure DevOps. So let's do that next. Let's navigate to GitHub and create a new directory here. I'm just going to use private for now, but I will open source it later. All right, let's add some descriptions. Strapi demo deployment to Azure and Docker. Okay, create repository and follow the next steps. We already did Git init, and let's add first commit. Well, let's add all the files first and then commit them. And let's add remote repository. It was just generated for us like this, and now we're ready to push. Git push. Well, first we need to add upstream master. Okay, now everything is inside of GitHub. Great. We're ready to connect this repository in Azure. So next step, we should navigate to Azure and start creating some services. All right, so let's open Azure portal. If you don't have Azure, it's pretty simple to set up your account. Just sign up for free account. I have some credits, but free account should be enough to run this app in a very minimal setup. So we'll use app services to host our Docker container. So I'm just gonna click here and create a new app service. All right, so I have my resource group. So I have sandbox created earlier. This one will be, let's name it Strapi demo tutorial. So we're going to use Docker container. Linux is fine. Central US is fine. You can pick your region depending where you are or where your customers will be. we're just gonna leave that by default, and the size we can start with a really basic one and then scale as needed. Next, we'll use single container. We'll stick with quick start. Nginx looks good. Monitoring, you can enable or disable depending on your plan. I don't have those available. Tags, I don't think we need any tags right now, so let's move on. Let's review. Everything looks good, and let's create a web app. All right, it should take a couple seconds to deploy everything and get ready. Okay, looks like it's complete. We can go to the resource and take a look. Right, everything is pretty empty. Azure gives us this nice URL, but we can connect custom domain later here. So before we start configuring and doing anything with it and deploying from our GitHub, we need to connect our database first. So before we can connect database, let's create that database in Azure as well. So we'll create a simple MySQL database. Let's go back here. We'll pick Azure database for MySQL. It's easy to set up. I already have one, but let's start from scratch. Let's create a new database. I'll pick my sandbox as a resource group. Server name will be Azure Strapi demo tutorial. The name should be unique, so pretty long. You can pick any database version of MySQL. We'll pick the latest. All right, so general purpose. Let's take a look what options we have. To save some costs, because it's pretty expensive, $55 per month, I'm gonna pick something really simple just for the demo purpose. But if you're gonna run production database, it's probably you want to be careful with the options that you choose. All right, so this is the smallest one that we have, and because I have a few of them created, the estimated cost for me will be $50 per month. All right, and that's minimal storage, backup, retention 7 days. All right, looks good, simple enough. Okay, let's set admin credentials. Okay, looks good. Password. Okay, looks good. Let's create our database. Should take a couple seconds. All right, so the new database is ready. Let's take a look. Okay, looks good. There's a server name, login name, everything is enabled. Let's go to our connection security to make sure that we can actually connect to it. So allow access to Azure services. We want to allow because we want to access this database from our Docker container. And later we want to connect to the database through like local workbench. So let's add our current IP address here. We don't want to enforce SSL connection again, because to run it locally or to connect to database from the workbench, we'll have to set up local certificates. So I want to disable this for now, but if it's a production database, you definitely want to have SSL connection enforced. Let's save our settings. Now that we have database connection done, we can go back to our web application and start adding those variables there. So let's navigate back to our app service and let's go to configuration. We already have some default variables here, but let's add a couple more. All right, so the first one is instance connection name. This is the host name that we use to connect to the database, and let's take a look in the new tab what it is. So let me open our MySQL tutorial and go to connection strings. All right, so it looks like the server name will be Azure Strapi demo tutorial, MySQL, Azure, this long string is going to be our host name. Great. Let's add next. We have database name. We haven't created that yet. The username, and I'll show you how to create one a bit later. The username will be, let's find it here. Okay. Copy, paste it here. Password. This is the password that we used before. Let's connect to our database from the local workbench. You can use any client. In this case, I use dbeaver. It's free. It does the job, so I'll use this one for now. So let's create a new connection, and we'll use MySQL. All right, now we can start adding the credentials from our database. So let's copy the username. Let's copy the server. We don't have any databases yet. It's just a server for now. Password, we'll use the one that we chose. Everything else is default. All right, let's test the connection. Looks good. Finish. All right, now we have new server connected here. As you can see, it's only system tables are here. So let's go ahead and execute a new SQL query to create a database. Create database, strappy db, just like that. And we want to run the script. So execute SQL. All right, success. Let's refresh and verify. Okay, now we have new MySQL database created here. Now we can add this database as one of the environment variables called database name. So we can connect to it, and it will be used by default by our Strapi application. Now we can add database name as one of the variables here. So let's add this. And we created strappy db. Okay, now we're ready to deploy it. After this, let's navigate to Deployment Center, and let's get started. So because we used GitHub, let's connect to GitHub. Let's authorize. And select the repository. So because we used Azure demo Strapi, it's master branch. Next. Docker file auto detected, port 1337, looks good. Let's continue. DevOps organization, because I already had one, I'm gonna use existing, but if you didn't, you should create one now. Project name, we're just gonna call it Strapi demo tutorial. And container registry, we can use existing or create a new one, doesn't really matter. So let's create a new one just for the sake of an example. We'll use everything by default, and done. As soon as it connects to the repository, it will kick off the first build, and we'll set up automatic pipeline for you. So now let's take a look at it. We'll open Azure DevOps, and you'll have all your pipelines and releases and everything here. So as you can see, the build is in progress. It's going to take a couple of minutes. So after the build and deployment is finished, we have the application running in Azure in production. So this is the URL I got from the app service, generated automatically. So here we can see Strapi is running in production. Let's go ahead and go to admin. The first time you visit admin in production, just like locally, it will ask you to register first admin user. It's going to be a bit slow because we use the lowest grade servers, so it's one CPU and the slowest database, just to save some costs. So that's why. Let's register. This is going to be a production user. And let's get started. Now let's come back to localhost and enable RESTful and GraphQL APIs and add a new collection. All right, so let's go to Marketplace, download GraphQL. Let's add a new collection type. So if I go to Content Type Builder, I can add a new collection. Let's name it Posts. Keep it really simple. Let's do title and content. Okay, now we can redeploy it back to Azure and see how it looks in production. Once everything is deployed, let's go and create a new post. Some simple text. Let's save it. And before we can do anything with this, we need to make sure that we take care of the permissions. All right, we want to open up read permissions for the post collection to everyone, so publicly accessible. So if I navigate to public permissions, we can see posts collection is listed here. We want to allow people to find it, find single posts, and see the count. Looks good. Let's save this. And now we can test RESTful APIs and GraphQL APIs. So if we go to posts, we can see the collection of our posts, which is just one for now. And let's take a look at GraphQL. So if I copy the URL and I open my local GraphQL client, because it's going to be post request. So as you can see, it's been connected. Now if I want to do posts and request title, content, and ID, I'm getting that back. If I want to see the schema, I can open up the docs and I can see what's available to me. All right, that was Strapi CMS in Azure.